Working the Tower of Terror wasn't supposed to be scary. I mean, sure, the setting is creepy: dusty chandeliers, flickering lights, a permanent air of decay hanging over everything. But once you've spent enough shifts leading guests through the same routine, it becomes just another job. At least, that's what I used to think. I've been an attendant here for almost a year. My job is simple: guide the guests through the dilapidated lobby, keep them in line, and lead them to the elevators that would take them on their eerie trip through the haunted hotel. I've grown to love it: the atmosphere, the occasional screams, the satisfaction of setting the perfect tone for the ride. But tonight, things were different. It started with the silence. Usually, the Hollywood Tower Hotel was filled with the noise of excited guests, families talking, kids running around, the constant hum of a packed theme park. But tonight, the lobby was almost deserted. Sure, there were guests, but they seemed quieter, more reserved, as if something was hanging in the air that they couldn't quite put their finger on. I led a group toward the elevators, my usual spiel prepared. I was just about to deliver my "Enjoy your stay forever" line when I saw him. Standing at the back of the line, barely visible in the dim light, was a tall man. At first glance, I thought he was just another guest, maybe someone who dressed up to fit the theme. But something about him didn't sit right with me. He was too still, too silent. The guests around him seemed uneasy too, though no one said anything. I kept an eye on him as I loaded the group into the elevator, making sure everyone was secured. I had seen plenty of strange things on this ride: people trying to scare each other, guests fainting from the anticipation. But this was different. The man remained at the back of the group, his face shadowed by the brim of a hat. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Just one more odd guest, right? But when the elevator doors closed and I watched the group disappear behind them, that strange feeling didn't leave me. It lingered, like a cold draft sneaking through a crack in the walls. I told myself it was nothing. I've done this ride 1,000 times. I know every detail of it by heart. Still, as I turned to prepare for the next group, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. It wasn't the guests that were making me uneasy. It was him. That tall, silent figure, standing just a little too far back, blending into the shadows a little too well. But I had a job to do. Guests were waiting, and there wasn't time to dwell on creepy figures. I brushed off the feeling and continued, though something in the back of my mind kept whispering that tonight was going to be different. As the next group of guests filed into the lobby, I tried to shake off the weird feeling that had settled over me. It was just another night, I told myself, just another shift at the Tower of Terror. I'd seen plenty of odd guests before. People love to get into the spirit of things, after all. But that tall man, something about him had stuck with me. I led the new group toward the elevator, just like I had countless times before. My routine was automatic by now. Step forward, give the instructions, send them off with a spooky flourish. But tonight, my attention kept drifting back to the control room screen, waiting for the previous elevator to return. 5 minutes passed, then 10. That was longer than usual. The ride only takes a few minutes from start to finish, and the elevators are usually back within moments to load the next batch of guests. I frowned and reached for the radio clipped to my belt. "Control, this is front of house. What's the holdup on car 3? There was a crackle of static before a voice came through, sounding slightly garbled. "We're experiencing some technical issues with the elevator system. We've got maintenance looking into it, but it's acting strange." I glanced back at the control screen. It flickered, showing static for a moment before the ride's layout reappeared. But car 3, the one I'd just sent up with the tall man, was still stuck somewhere between floors. "Strange how?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Glitches weren't uncommon, but this felt different. I couldn't quite explain it. "Elevator hasn't returned. We're working on it, but just hold tight." I didn't like the sound of that. I turned back to the new group of guests, trying to mask my growing unease with the usual haunted hotel theatrics. I had a job to do, after all, and they were expecting a show. I forced a smile, led them to the elevator, and watched as the doors slid shut behind them. As soon as they were out of sight, I reached for the radio again. Is car 3 empty? I asked, keeping my voice low. Maybe it was just a simple technical issue. Maybe the guests were fine, and the ride would be back to normal in no time. No, came the response after a long pause. It's still stuck. We're trying to reset the system, but the guests, they haven't come back yet. My hand tightened around the radio. Guests stuck in the middle of the ride was one thing, but a group vanishing altogether, that was something else entirely. I stared at the control panel as the screen flickered again, the familiar layout of the Tower of Terror flashing in and out of focus. Car 3 was still out there, somewhere between floors. Somewhere that it shouldn't be. And that tall man. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Where was he now? Was he still with the guests, stuck inside the elevator? Or had he disappeared into the shadows like he never existed in the first place? The radio crackled once more. Just keep loading the guests, we'll get it sorted. I nodded, though a cold pit was beginning to form in my stomach. Something was wrong, and no amount of reassurance from the control room was going to change that. The next group had already been loaded, and I was doing my best to put on a brave face, but the longer I stood there, the more that gnawing feeling of unease settled in. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake it. I kept glancing at the control screen, but the elevator I'd just sent up was moving normally, or at least it seemed that way. Then, the first elevator, the one that had been stuck, finally returned. I rushed to meet it as the doors slowly slid open, but what I found was silence. There was no one inside, no guests, no sign that they had ever been there. I stood there, staring into the empty elevator car, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. How could the elevator come back empty? Then I noticed something. On one of the seats, there was a phone. It was still recording, its camera facing out toward the elevator doors, as if it had been placed there intentionally to capture something. I reached in, grabbed it, and stared at the screen for a moment. The timer on the recording was still going, ticking upward. What happened to the guests? Why was the phone still recording? I didn't have time to think about it right then. Another group of guests had already lined up, waiting for their turn. I pocketed the phone and stepped back into my role, leading the next group toward the same elevator I had just pulled the phone from. I forced a smile, trying to calm the growing dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. Once the guests were loaded and on their way, I took a deep breath and pulled out the phone. The video started normally enough. The guests were laughing and chatting, excited about the ride. The usual pre-show sequence played out, with the familiar dim lighting and ominous music. They were having fun, completely unaware of what was coming. But as the elevator ascended, something strange happened. The first scene, the one where the ghostly characters invite the guests to stay forever, was different. There, standing behind the transparent figures, was a man, a tall, motionless figure that I recognized immediately. The tall man, the one I'd seen standing at the back of the line. I watched in silence as the elevator continued upward. The guests seemed oblivious to the figure's presence, their excitement building as the ride progressed. But I knew better. I had seen this scene play out hundreds of times, and that man wasn't supposed to be there. My heart pounded as I continued to watch. The elevator was about to reach the second scene, the mirror room, where the guests would see their own reflections before the final drop. But instead of the familiar mirror, the doors opened to something entirely different. The room was dark, desolate, like a forgotten, twisted version of the hotel. The walls were cracked and pieces of debris littered the floor. Shadows flickered across the room, moving unnaturally. And in the far corner, standing motionless, was the tall man, watching. Before I could process what I was seeing, my radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Did car 3 ever return?" came the voice from the control room. I blinked, still holding the phone. "Yeah, it came back. I just sent another group up." There was a long pause on the other end of the radio, the static buzzing in my ear. "That's impossible," the voice said, quieter now, more urgent. "The first group still hasn't returned." The control room's words echoed in my ears, sending a jolt of fear through me. The first group still hasn't returned. I stared at the radio, Then back at the elevator I had just sent up with another group of guests. How could that be? The first elevator had come back. It was empty, but it returned. And now there were more guests up there, heading into something I couldn't explain. My heart raced. I wanted to believe it was just a technical glitch, something that could be easily fixed with a reset, but the phone's video told a different story. Something far worse was happening, and I was in the middle of it. I couldn't stop thinking about the last thing I saw on the video, the dark, desolate room where the mirror scene should have been. I had seen it 1,000 times. The mirror, the guests' reflections, the slow build-up to the drop. But this was something else entirely. The room in the video was ruined, as if the hotel had been abandoned for years. The walls were cracked, the furniture shattered, and shadows slithered along the walls like living things. And in the corner, watching silently, was the tall man. The same figure I had seen earlier in the lobby. The same figure that shouldn't have been there. My hand trembled as I fumbled for the radio again. "Control," I whispered, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "The second group, the one I just sent up. Are they okay?" There was a long, tense silence before the reply came, the static from the radio crackling in my ear. "We haven't seen them yet. The system's acting up. We're trying to get a visual, but no, they haven't come back either." I felt a wave of nausea. 2 groups of guests, gone. No sign of them, no word from them. And that empty elevator, the phone recording. I couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't just a malfunction. This wasn't just the ride acting up. Someone was inside the Tower of Terror, and they weren't following the script. I glanced at the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the video. Should I keep watching? Did I even want to know what came next? Before I could make a decision, the elevator doors in front of me slid open again with a soft hiss. I jumped, heart pounding, expecting to see another empty car. But instead, the elevator was filled with something far worse. The guests, those I had just sent up moments ago, were back. But they weren't moving. They sat perfectly still, their faces pale and expressionless, eyes wide and unblinking. It was as if they had been frozen in place, trapped in some nightmarish state. And there was the tall man. He stood perfectly still, his unnaturally long arms hanging at his sides, his faceless head tilted slightly downward as if he were staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as the cold realization washed over me. I wasn't looking at guests anymore. I was looking at something else. Something that had taken them. Something that would take me if I didn't send him more. The elevator doors slowly slid shut, and the lights in the lobby flickered. The sound of the machinery whirled back to life, and I knew, in that moment, we weren't in control of the Tower of Terror anymore.